Check this out. This little lens is an 11mm f2.8 fisheye for sensors up to full frame, and it costs less than 300 euros. And I have to tell you, it left me speechless. My name is Miguel Azorín, and I welcome you once again to Natural Portraits, the YouTube channel dedicated to nature and natural photography in the broadest sense we could imagine. In this video, we are going to take an in-depth look at this 11mm f2.8 fisheye from TTArtisan, which you can get for less than 300 euros. If you're a regular follower of the channel, you'll know that I've already tested other lenses from TTArtisan with varying results. And I have to say that I've noticed a significant improvement in the quality of this brand's lenses. While the first models I tried had rather limited quality, especially at maximum aperture, the latest lenses they've sent me are honestly very good, especially the 100mm f2.8 Macro 2x, an incredibly powerful lens for its price. A little over a month ago, they contacted me again to test this lens I have here, an 11mm f2.8 fisheye lens for sensors up to full frame. And considering that I was preparing my astrophotography trip to the Atacama Desert in Chile and the Uyuni Salt Flats in Bolivia, it was the perfect opportunity to put this lens to the test under those skies. But before moving on to the results, let's take a look at this lens. As you can see, this is quite a small lens, especially considering that it's an ultra-wide angle for full-frame cameras, where you would expect a much larger lens. However, just because it's small doesn't mean it's not a bit heavy. We're talking about a lens that is entirely constructed from metal. In fact, as with the other TTArtisan lenses I've tried, the only plastic part I can see is the rear cap. The rest of the lens is entirely made of metal. This construction makes it feel like a robust lens. It feels quite solid and weighs between 439 and 600 grams, depending on the mount you choose. By the way, speaking of mounts, you can find this lens for the main mounts on the market: Sony E, Nikon Z, Nikon F, L mount, Canon RF, and Canon EF. And as with many TTArtisan lenses, we're talking about a fully manual lens. Here we have a completely manual focus ring, which I have to say is quite stiff. Personally, I appreciate this because when working with manual lenses, especially at night, it's very easy, while handling the camera, to accidentally move the focus ring if it's too loose. If it's a bit stiffer, it's going to be harder to move accidentally and will ensure we have precise focus throughout the entire session. We also have a fully manual aperture that ranges from f2.8 to f16. In this regard, I have to mention that it's a progressive aperture, meaning it doesn't have the typical clicks you'd find on other photographic lenses. I have to consider this as a downside for this lens, because if we don't have any kind of communication with the camera, and on top of that, we can't adjust the aperture based on clicks, we'll never know exactly which aperture setting we're using. We can get a rough idea, but not with complete precision. The lens features an ED optical design with extra low dispersion, consisting of 11 elements in 7 groups for mirrorless models and 12 elements in 10 groups for DSLR models. And according to the manufacturer, it covers a field of view of 180 degrees. This would be with a full-frame sensor, since cropped sensors will cut off part of that field. And while in other cases, at this point, we've gone out into the field to test the lens. But as I mentioned, I've already done this homework and have been testing it both in night photography and nighttime lapse under the stunning skies of the Uyuni Salt Flats in Bolivia. Let's move to the computer and review the results. Alright, here I have some photos marked with 2 stars that are quite conclusive regarding the quality of this TTArtisan lens, this 11mm f2.8 fisheye. Let's take a look at them. First, let's look at this one here. As you can see, the distortion it produces in the image field is quite noticeable. Keep in mind that this photo was taken with an APS-C sensor, a cropped sensor. As you can see, the camera used was a Sony a6400, a Sony from the APS-C range. Therefore, this distortion would be even more pronounced if we were working with a full-frame sensor. You can also see that we don't get any information about the aperture used, since this is a fully manual lens with no connections to the camera, so we don't have that data. but I can confirm that all the photos we're going to review were taken at maximum aperture, that is, at f2.8. And what we're seeing here is already quite striking, at least with an APS-C sensor. And even at this magnification, the sharpness of the stars across the entire image field is already quite remarkable. If we look at the off-road vehicles here in the foreground, we can see that when we zoom into 100%, the definition is good, or at least as good as one would expect. Keep in mind that these photos were taken at ISO 6400 with 25 seconds of exposure, so there is some noise. That's completely normal, but the sharpness I see is perfect. In fact, you can even read the logo on the door here, Bolivian salt. But what really matters to those of us who do night photography and astrophotography is the quality the lens delivers at the edges, especially when we're photographing stars. So let's take a look. If we come over here, check out what we've got. At maximum aperture, f2.8, we can see that the lens shows minimal chromatic aberration, a slight purple halo and maybe a greenish or bluish tint, but that's when we zoom in to 100%. But what really stands out to me is how pinpoint the stars appear. They show a bit of trailing because it's a 25-second exposure without using a tracker or anything like that, but notice that the stars don't show any coma at all, not even at the very edge of the photo. If we move to the upper right corner, we find pretty much the same thing. We see pinpoint stars all the way to the very edge of the photograph. Look, over here we have the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is rendered with a lot of detail. And if we go to the center of the image, notice that here the stars are super tiny, really minuscule. Honestly, they're like pinpricks. So the first thing that caught my attention is the quality this lens offers at maximum aperture. In other words, the image is absolutely corrected. Now let's compare it with the image I got using another lens. In this case, a lens that's supposedly higher end than this TTArtisan, which is the Viltrox 13mm f2.8, a lens that, in this case, is actually an automatic lens. Here you can see that it's at 39mm because it's a prime lens, with a 20-second exposure at maximum aperture, f1.4. And if we zoom in on the corners, take a look at what we have here. We have a coma effect that, while not overly exaggerated, is still clearly visible. If we look at this enlargement, here it almost goes unnoticed, but if we zoom in to 100%, it's perfectly clear how that coma appears in the stars. But if we go back to the TTArtisan 11mm f2.8, notice the difference when it comes to the stars. We can see it clearly here. We can see how these stars show that very characteristic coma typical of wide-angle lenses, but if we switch to the fisheye, look at the difference. So I have to say that even though this is an f2.8 lens and it doesn't have the brightness of the f1.4, the sharpness of the stars is much higher. Even so, looking at the photo as a whole, notice the size of the stars in this image, how they appear very tiny and pinpoint. And notice that here they look chunkier, more bloated. Another thing that really caught my attention about this TTArtisan is how it handles reflections. Here, in this image, we don't have any light pointing directly at the camera. But if we look, for example, at photos like this one, where there's a light shining directly at the camera, notice how there isn't any kind of reflection anywhere in the photo. Likewise, we still have that sharpness in the starbursts and the control over reflections is very, very good. However, with the Viltrox lens we saw a moment ago, this little light here, which is much smaller than the one in this image, already produces a small reflection, a slight flare. But does this TTArtisan lens produce any kind of reflection? Well, let's take a look. It really has to be with extremely powerful lights. Lights that would ruin any photo at all, before we can actually see any reflection or flare. Let's also review some other photos I've selected here. For example, this image is part of a time-lapse that you'll see next, but notice how here we also have that field distortion produced by the fisheye lens, which is completely natural for this type of lens. But once again, we have lights in the scene, and there's no kind of reflection at all. Here we have a blue light, red lights, and still there's no reflection, with the entire image field perfectly corrected. Here we have, in fact, a photograph where there is a powerful red light pointing directly at the camera, and in this case, yes, we do see some flares, some reflections. But once again, it comes down to the same thing. this image would be completely unusable. And in those photographs where there is some kind of stray light in the scene, but it doesn't actually ruin the image, as we can see here, we get a very interesting level of control over reflections. Now let's take a look at one last photograph, which I've chosen because in this image there's no strong light, no stray light, apart from the little lights visible throughout the scene. This is a photograph that was taken during that time lapse, but in this case, we were all sheltered inside the vehicles, so the cameras were outside shooting without any added light. And look at the management that this objective does. As I mentioned, it's an f2.8, which means we have to increase the ISO sensitivity in dark places like this, up to high sensitivities such as ISO 6400. But notice that we have a wide-angle fisheye lens that gives us incredible quality for night photography and astrophotography. A lens that, as you can see, we can use perfectly well at f2.8 at its maximum aperture. While it's true that I haven't done tests with smaller apertures, it's simply because I haven't needed to. We just have to look at photos like this one, the first we saw, to go to the center of the image and realize, by observing how the stars are rendered, that we don't need to use smaller apertures than f2.8. And nowadays, finding a wide-angle lens that allows us to work at maximum aperture while having almost perfect star images across the entire field of view is really difficult. Well, as you've seen, for less than €300, this is a surprising lens. We have to keep in mind that we're going to get those distortions produced by the fisheye effect, or maybe that's exactly what we're looking for. But at this price, there are few lenses on the market that offer this level of quality, especially when thinking about night photography, and even less so among fisheye lenses. So I think it's an excellent option as an ultra-wide-angle lens for tight budgets. I hope you found this video interesting and that it was helpful to you. See you again next week, right here on Natural Portraits. Goodbye.